Welcome back everyone. Hi, if you're new, my name is Tori and today I'm going to share with you guys some of my most disappointing reads of 2021. I've mentioned this a couple of times already, but 2021 has just not been, unfortunately, it's just not been my reading year. I've read a lot of books this year that I just thought were good, some I thought were okay, but just, you know, unmemorable for the most part, unexciting overall. But these 8 that I want to share with you are just in a different league. I can genuinely say these are 8 of the books this year that I just did not enjoy. There are actually 2 books on this list that started off really strongly for me in the beginning and I was really enjoying them, but just for whatever reason the story either took a turn or my interest in the story took a turn. So we're gonna get into those as well. And then the other 5 or 6 that I want to talk about, those are just no. I hope you like this video. Let's get started. So the first book I want to talk about is The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan He, and this is a young adult science fiction novel. One of my biggest issues with this book is that I found it to be so needlessly convoluted. And I feel like this book did not have strong enough characters, strong enough setting or world building to justify it being as convoluted as it was. And not even just all over the place on a structure level, on plot level, just even in different scenes. There were too many scenes where I felt like I was having to work a little bit too hard to figure out what was just logistically happening in the scene. Sometimes characters would have lines of dialogue in a scene and I'm like, where did this character just come from? I didn't know. I realized they were in the room. Just little things like that just kind of kept adding up over the course of the story. And I feel like on the whole, like as a reader, you are trying to desperately keep up with what is happening in the story and just things are not flowing the way that they should be while you're reading this book. And because of that, there are some pretty major reveals that happen in the story, some pretty significant emotional beats that happen in the book that just don't hit the way that they should. They don't land. And I just realized I haven't even explained what this book is about. The Earth has suffered all these different environmental catastrophes, and so humans have found a way to create these eco-cities. And so throughout the story, we're following 2 sisters, one of whom lives in one of these eco-cities and the other who wakes up on this abandoned island with no memory of who she is or how she got there. And the 2 of them throughout the story are trying to find their way back to each other. On the whole, aside from it being all over the place, I feel like the character that we're following in the eco-city just was not strong enough to be carrying those chapters like she was. I never really got this sense of grounding with the setting. I never felt comfortable in this world and how things work. It was just kind of an unpleasant reading experience. So this is the first book making the list. The next book making this list is The Chain by Adrienne McKenty, and this is a thriller novel. And this is one of the 2. There's another one on this list. This was one that I was actually really enjoying in the first half, but the second half just really erased a lot of the things that I enjoyed about the first half of the book. I just feel like the second half was just so unnecessary. Like the second half of this book just really ruined the whole book for me. I didn't enjoy the second half at all. I was just like, why are we being given this information? We could have done without this. The book was a lot more exciting when we were focusing on the problems of the first half. Oh, just even thinking about it now makes me kind of upset because I was really loving this book. So in this, we're following this main character who gets a message one morning that says her daughter has been kidnapped, and the only way that she's going to get her daughter back is if she goes and kidnaps another child. And she becomes a part of this long chain of parents who have been kind of roped into this really just unfortunate, creepy situation. And the first half of the book is just so good in building that tension and that fear, and just it was so suspenseful, and you know, it really showed the lengths that parents will go to in order to get their children back. And I love that aspect of the story. I thought it was so good in the first half, but so for the second half to just come in and just really undo all of the excitement that I felt while reading the first half, like it was pretty bad. So I'm obviously not gonna say what happens in the second half, but the book does take on a pretty different tone, and it was just not, unfortunately, just not for me. So the next disappointing read I want to talk about is The Whisper Man by Alex North. This is another thriller, and this was just so boring. It's not engaging. It's not, I don't know. This just really, I should have DNF'd this book. But I keep reading because I want to see, like, it's a thriller. I want to see, like, what's going to happen. Is there going to be something major going on? And it wasn't. I don't have anything else to add about my thoughts on the Whisper Man. It really was that. It was just really dull. So we're following this father and son who move into this new town after the death of his wife. And this town does have a really dark history. Years ago, this criminal known as the Whisper Man would find these children who seem neglected or lonely and stalk them and whisper in their bedroom windows and essentially lure them away from their families, and that would be the last time they were ever seen. So the Whisper Man was, this is not a spoiler, the Whisper Man was captured all those years ago, but when the father and son move into this new town, there's similar criminal activity happening in the same vein of the Whisper Man's MO, and then things really take a turn when our main character's son becomes potentially the next victim of this like copycat Whisper Man. That sounds really fascinating, but it just really turned out not to be. So it's really more so about the father and son dynamic throughout the story and how this dad is now trying to cope with the loss of his wife while trying to still parent his child. And it really could have just been a story about that without the added element of the Whisper Man, because that just, I don't know, it wasn't given, what's that TikTok sound? It didn't give what it was supposed to give. The next book I want to talk about is This Vicious Cure by Emily Sue Veda, and this is the third and final book in the This Mortal Coil trilogy. This is a young adult science fiction trilogy. And with this, I didn't really enjoy book 2. I loved book 1. Book 1 was one of the best books I read. In whatever year I read it. But then book 2 really took a turn. In the second book, characters weren't behaving like they normally would. You can tell that they were just doing things to, for the sake of advancing the plot. And so that a lot of that was happening in book 2. Book 2 was so angsty. And book 1 was a little bit angsty too, but I feel like the science in book 1 and like the excitement of book 1 really overshadowed that, and the newness of like the world just felt very exciting. Book 1 was really good. If book 1 had been a little bit longer, this whole trilogy honestly could have been a standalone. And so I finished book 3 and I thought the series would go back uphill again, and it did not. I actually enjoyed This Vicious Cure less than I enjoyed This Cruel Design, which is book 2, which if I didn't even realize that was possible. The books have these like cliffhanger chapters that keep you turning the page, and in the first book that worked really well because you're just like, oh my god, like what is going on? Everything is like, this is so wild, everything is amazing. But by the time you get to the third book and that's still happening, it doesn't have the same effect that it once did in book 1. It's more like, okay, like let's get to the point. I think the angst of the story and that fast pacedness of the story really started to overshadow the actual quality of the plot. That's unfortunate because the story itself is actually really good. It takes place in this world where people have panels in their arms and they can control different aspects of their genetics and alter themselves, and it's really fascinating. And there's this like pandemic that's been going on, and there's a lot of heavy science that we get in book 1. And so our main character is a gene hacker, and so she knows how to really get into these panels and use her hacking skills. And then as the books progress, we start to get into these really heavy topics about like DNA and sentience and certain beings, and the science behind it becomes really fascinating, and you can tell that Emily Sue Veda knows like what she's talking about. It's all very believable the way that it's incorporated into the story, but I feel like the characters and the angst just started to really overshadow the quality of that. So unfortunately, This Vicious Cure did not turn the series around for me like I thought it would, but it doesn't take away from the fact that This Mortal Coil I thought was an incredible sci-fi story. So if you are interested, I would recommend the first book, but just be aware that books 2 and 3 are not of the same caliber in my opinion as book 1. So the next book I want to talk about is kind of a big one. The more I think about this book, the less I like it. I've never said anything like this on my channel before, but if you are a fan of this book, like a hardcore fan, please just skip ahead because I know this fan base is a little bit wild. But the next book making this list is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Like The Chain, this is a book that I was really enjoying when I first started it. I was immediately intrigued by Quoth and the mystery surrounding him and how he became this like supposedly legendary figure. I was hooked immediately, but I feel like my intrigue, my fascination, if you will, with Quoth, it only carried me so far in the story. And then I would say around like maybe 250, 300, my interest started really slipping away to the point where I just found the book to be a little bit boring, and just something about it just became a little bit too slow paced for me, a little bit too boring, a little bit too repetitive, and I just wasn't really enjoying it anymore after a while. And I think it was also attributed to the fact that Quoth was the only character that I actually really enjoyed in the story. I felt like I didn't really have any other character that I could latch onto and say, oh yeah, I really enjoyed that character, or this character was great. It was just Quoth, and after a while he wasn't doing it for me anymore. So this is funny because I feel like people enjoy the story a lot more once Quoth gets to like the university section of his life. I actually loved the chapters when Quoth was on the road with his parents, and then when he was roughing it in Tarbine and like trying to, you know, defend himself on the streets. I love those chapters. There was something about those chapters that just even like drew me to Quoth even more, and I was rooting for him even more. But then it just got so, once he hit university, it just got a little bit too boring for me, and I wanted to see more of the magic system. It definitely has one of the most unique magic systems I've read about, but we didn't really get a lot of it in book one, and kind of wanted more of that. The whole premise of the book, if you're unfamiliar, is that Quoth is this, like I mentioned, this mysterious legendary figure, and by the time we meet him in book one, he's already had all these adventures essentially. And so this chronicler, he wants to tell Quoth's story, but Quoth then tells the chronicler that his story is going to take 3 days to tell. So the name of the wind becomes day one. I don't know the name of this. I think it's the wise man's fear becomes day two, and then we don't have a day three yet. So the first book is just the first day of Quoth telling his story, and I've accepted the fact the name of the wind is just not for me. I think it's just a little bit too dull for my tastes, and by the end of it I was just like, no desire to see where Quoth goes, but best of luck to him. So now that we got those books out of the way, these last three that I want to talk about, I saved these for last because these are like the cream of the crop, if you will. Like, these are the three that just really I was about to say grinds my gears. I couldn't think of anything else to say. I should have put all three of these down at some point, but I did not. So here we are. The next book I want to talk about is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. Oh my god. This is a sci-fi novel. This is a first contact story, and this is so unnecessarily long. This has to be the longest, most repetitive, most dry first contact story that I can think of at the moment. I read this book like back in February or March, so this book has been sitting with me for a long time. I've had a long time to think about how much I disliked To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. The cast of characters, there are so many of them, and not one has any kind of like ounce of depth or character, like personality. It's like these characters are just there. They're not interesting. I don't know, they're not exciting, they're not interesting. And to be perfectly honest, the editor, we could have slashed the book in half. We could have cut off at least 300 pages. To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is a long book that feels like a long book. I think after page like 200, every time you flip the page, you feel it. You're just like, oh my god, it's like 700 pages left in this book. Like, how? After the initial excitement wore off of this parasitic being attaching to our main character, after that wore off, I was just like, oh my god. Like, I don't think I've ever mentioned this before, but our main character in this, Kira, I still remember her name. How do I say this? It's very obvious that she was written by a man. I don't know how else to explain that. It's just, it is what it is. This is the first time I've ever said anything like this on my channel, because I've read plenty of books with female characters written by men, but it's either done well enough where you don't notice it, you just read and it's a good story, or it doesn't matter. But this was very like, it was, I don't know, it was very clearly obvious. There were so many scenes talking about how like Kira had to get like her emotions under control and she couldn't be so emotional, and well, that's To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. Far too long, far too dull, far too many uninteresting and unmemorable characters. So there's that. The second to last book I want to talk about is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This is a book I read back in the summer, and honestly, I don't have too much to say about this book. I'm going to keep this extremely brief, but if you know A Little Life, if you've read it, if you've seen it going around, you know that it is extremely dark, extremely depressing, and has been described by so many people as quote-unquote trauma porn. And I can confirm now that that is 100% true. With A Little Life, the trauma in it, yes, it's beyond excessive. It is, I can't think of another word for it. It's just, it's beyond that. It's extreme. I think a lot of people who read this just fall in love with the characters, like the friend group, Jude, Willem, Malcolm, and I forget the other person's name. They fall in love with the friend group, but they're not good friends. For me, that excessive trauma, that excessive abuse and excessive trauma only, that's not all that makes a good story for me. That's not all that makes me attached to characters. I feel like a lot of instances in this book were kind of emotionally manipulative, and after a while it just did not have, I don't know, it wasn't affecting me the way that I think it was impacting a lot of different readers. Yeah, so those are my thoughts on A Little Life. It was not for me overall. And then finally, the last book I want to talk about is one that I'm also going to mention pretty briefly because, and that's Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. We're following this young woman who is, at the start of the novel, she is called away from her friend's birthday party to come get this child that she babysits. Takes the child to the grocery store. Our main character is black. The child that she babysits for is white. That's important to know. They go to the grocery store. They go to this ritzy grocery store, and the security guard is called because someone thinks that our main character has kidnapped the child. It becomes this whole thing. It's caught on camera. But that inciting incident doesn't have a lot to do with like the trajectory of the rest of the book. It's just kind of like that one moment. It does come back into play a little bit later, but really the entire story is that we're following this young woman who, you know, she's a recent college graduate. She's kind of aimless, just trying to figure out her life, what she wants to do. And so we're following her. We're following her new boyfriend. We're following the wife in the family that she babysits for. Just kind of how their stories are interconnected in the midst of racism and microaggressions and like white saviorism and feminism, and it just becomes this journey for these three different characters. And I feel like there are a lot of characters in here that represent very specific tropes, but they have no substance to support the tropes that they represent. It's just, they all feel very, very flat. The story itself is very flat. I was not a fan of our main character's friend group. I found them to be pretty insufferable, honestly, in some of their scenes, especially one scene at the end. There's this interview that takes place, and I already wasn't really liking the book up until that point, and I don't know, that whole scene just kind of blew my mind. I mentioned this before, the characters are all just cardboard cutouts of what they are meant to represent. I feel like a lot of the themes that are trying to be explored throughout this book have been done so much better in plenty of other books. So yeah, those are my rambly thoughts on Such a Fun Age, and it's probably one of my least favorite books I've read in a very long time. So that's it for me, you guys. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. Let me know down in the comments what have been some of your most disappointing books of 2021. And then the next video that is going to go up after this is the big one, the best books of 2021, where I can finally celebrate and gush about all the books that I did love throughout 2021. So that is going to be up pretty soon. I hope you enjoyed that. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I will see you guys in the next video. Take care.